chapter 6, the self and personality. Really fascinating chapter. Well, as far as I'm concerned, anyway. I guess I find them all pretty interesting. Otherwise, I wouldn't be teaching the class. Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about is the 20 statements test. A really fascinating test. Came out in 1960. It's only two questions, and one of them is who am I or I am, and you just finish the statement, and you make 20 statements about yourself. The test usually takes a few minutes. I've given the test to students. Sometimes it's hard to come up with 20 things that you are. The test is unusual in utilizing an open question methodology, taking coding non straightforward, making the coding non-straightforward. Kuhn in 1960 has stated that responses to the 20 statements test should be grouped in five categories. Social groups and classifications. I am social groups and I'm a Methodist. I'm Jewish. I'm white. Ideological beliefs. I'm a Christian. I'm Jewish. I'm Muslim. Interests. I'm a baseball fan. I like football. Ambitions. I want to be a lawyer. I want to be a doctor. I want to be a college professor and not do any work for the rest of my life. Or self-evaluations. I am tall. I'm handsome. I am blonde. Whatever. I have blue eyes. Self-evaluations, and there are the 20. There are the statements that you make. Who am I? I am tall. I am short. The 20 statements test is one of the most widely used cross-cultural psychological measures. Americans most often mention personal traits, attitudes, and abilities, which accounted for about 48% of their self-description. The American pattern is similar to many of the Western cultures. Australia, Britain, Sweden, Canada all had similar type answers. When other cultural groups were given the same measure, the results were very much different. The Maasai and the Samburu of Kenya had only 2% of their self-descriptions reflect personal characteristics. 60% of their description encompassed their social membership and roles. Now, one of the things that you need to remember is that people in the United States are very diverse. People in Britain, people in Canada, maybe not so much Sweden, but Australia, a lot of immigrants in the area. If you're a Sumburu or you're Maasai, then you're Sumburu and Maasai, and all the people around you are Sumburu and Maasai. So there are some things that you don't have to say. It would be the same way in Japan, because everybody in Japan, almost everybody in Japan, about 95% of the population are Japanese. So you wouldn't think, you wouldn't call yourself Japanese. I mean, that would be silly because everybody that you know is Japanese. But in the United States, you might say, well, I'm Dutch or I'm American Indian. And it's because there are so many people that are around you that are different. You normally, people in the United States don't just live around people like them. They live around a lot of different people. Not only that, but our television, of course, has people that are from California, from New York, people that live in cities, people that live in the country. Lots of different ways of describing ourselves in the United States. Whereas if you were Sumburu or Maasai, then possibly the only people around you would be people like you. So when they looked at the Maasai and the Sumburu, 60% of their descriptions encompassed their social membership and their roles because that was the only difference between them and the people around them. The Maasai and the Samburu pattern of a greater emphasis on roles and membership appears in the cultures from much of the rest of the world, and these cultural differences are already evident among kindergarten children. Cook Islanders, Malaysians, Chinese, Native Americans, other Africans besides the Samburu and Maasai, Puerto Ricans, Indians from Asia, Japanese. These are people from the Cook Islands. These are Cook Islanders. A Danish study by Ma et al. In 2012 looked at functional MRIs when participants were evaluating personal characteristics. The Danish participants showed no difference in their functional MRIs when they considered their social roles or their personal characteristics. Both involve the medial prefrontal cortex, which is typically activated in self-judgments. When the researchers performed the same functional MRI on Chinese participants, their medial prefrontal cortex was only activated when they were considered personal characteristics. When the Chinese thought of their social roles, their temporoparietal junction was activated. This is a region that more typically is involved in understanding other people's beliefs. So when you're thinking about other people and what you think that they think, that's when the temporoparietal junction was activated. Ma et al. In 2012 suggested that the Chinese participants were more likely thinking about other people's beliefs when they thought about their social roles. Though we are all individuals, humans are also a highly social species. Social interaction is a continuous balancing act between focusing on our differences and seeking our connection with others. Marcus and Kitayama first identified the independent view of the self in 1991. Independent individuals experience their identities as largely distinct from their relationships. Independent individuals are self-defining. Their attitudes, their personality traits, preferences, opinions, abilities, individual qualities. The self's experiences are rather stable and does not change much from situation to situation. The independent view of self is experienced as self-contained and exists as a relatively coherent and inviolate entity. Relationships vary and are very fluid, as individuals tend to be closer to close relations than distant ones. Individuals with independent identities still feel much closer to in-group than out-group members. However, they do not view them in fundamentally distinct ways. The main bifurcation is between self and non-self, and both in-group and out-group members are non-selves. They're not you. They're someone else. Marcus and Kitayama in 1991 also identified the interdependent self. The self overlaps quite a bit with an individual's significant relationships. Interdependent individuals are closely connected with others and are not experienced as distinct, unique entities. Interdependent entities are grounded in their relationships with others. Relationships come in a variety of forms, and they require people to take on particular roles such as father, student, friend, lover, daughter, that govern how they feel and behave toward their relationship partners. The identity of the interdependent individual is experienced as somewhat fluid in different situations. Depending on the situation and the role the person occupies in that situation, the person's experience of their self will vary accordingly. Their experience of their self will vary accordingly. Relationships with one's in-group members are self-defining for those with interdependent selves. Thus, the people in the in-group assume considerable importance. People do not easily become in-group members, nor do close relationships easily dissipate into out-group relations. In 2007, Zhu, Zhang, Fan, and Han conducted an interesting functional MRI experiment on Western and Chinese participants. They asked the participants whether select trait adjectives characterized themselves or their mothers. Westerners showed different regions of the brain activation, suggesting that they represent themselves and their mothers in distinct ways. When the Chinese were evaluating themselves or their mothers, they showed activation patterns in the same regions for the two tasks, the medial prefrontal cortex, an area linked with self-representations. In other words, they feel that their mother is the same as themselves, or they think of themselves as part of their mother. um, whereas Westerners do not. Independent selves have a number of close relationships with members of their in-group. However, these relationships are less self-defining than are the corresponding relationships of those with more interdependent selves. Interdependent selves identify more strongly with their in-group, while independent selves have a more permeable relationship. Because in-group relations are so critical for self-definition for people in more interdependent cultures, and because they serve to direct appropriate behaviors, it is especially necessary to identify those with whom one has such significant relationships. Obligations to others are an important part of in-group relations among interdependent people, so it is of vital importance for them to distinguish those toward whom they have obligations from those they do not. Becoming a member of an interdependent individual's in-group is thus a rather substantial accomplishment, and such relationships should be entered cautiously, because you owe these people something. They owe you something. So entering in a relationship like this will take a lot of time. A more independent person is likely to perceive themselves as existing and functioning separately from the social environment. The environment is more tangential to the independent person's identity. Relationships can be formed and broken without having a large impact on the independent person's identity. And so this is the way it is in the United States. In the United States, we are more independent. Therefore, we are not as strongly connected to our environments as people who are interdependent. Now, for many for many people who are interdependent, for the people on the Navajo Nation, because you belong to a clan, because you belong to an area, um, you are more interdependent than independent. You belong to the environment. The people in your environment are similar to you. Whereas somebody like me, I'm from Indiana. I've lived in 17 different states. I've lived in two countries other than the United States, and because of that, I am more independent. I have to find a identity within myself rather than within my environment. So, despite the fact I live in Iowa, I really don't identify as somebody from Iowa, as a Hawkeye. I don't really identify with that because I have so many other identities that I've had uh, since I was born. I grew up in Indiana. I've lived in Texas and Maryland and Oklahoma and Nebraska and Montana and Arizona and California. I've lived a lot of different places, and because of that, I have to have a more independent personality because I do not identify with my environment. People with independent selves are more willing to form new relationships, maintain larger networks of relationships, and be less distressed should any of these relationships fade away over time. And the reality is, I've had very few friends for my entire life. I don't really identify with the people in Indiana, and I don't really identify with my friends in Oklahoma, or my friends in Texas, or my friends in Montana, or my friends in Japan or Germany. I identify with wherever I am, and it is a tangential thing. It changes, and I know that it could change again. For independent persons, in groups and out groups are less consequential to self construction. There is convergent evidence of heightened distinction between in groups and out groups among those who are more interdependent. Collectivistic cultures, such as the Japanese, richly describe this pronounced difference in behavior between contexts involving in-groups, uchi, and those involving out-groups, soto. So these are, wait a minute, Sailor Moons. These girls are dressed up like Sailor Moon. This would be their uchi. Their uchi would be Sailor Moon. They identify with Sailor Moon. And anybody who doesn't identify with Sailor Moon would be Soto, an outgroup. Studies have found that Asian Americans were more accurate than European Americans in identifying the emotions experienced by their close friends. European Americans were more accurate than Asian Americans in identifying the emotions that were experienced by strangers. And this is from research from Kellums and Blaskovich in 2012. In places like Japan, where commitment to in-group members is strong, there should be less of a willingness to cooperate with outgoing members. People with interdependent selves focus their trust on people they share some kind of relationship. Yamagashi and Yamagashi in 1994 found that Americans tend to have higher levels of general trust than the Japanese do. Why? Because the Americans are independent. They're more willing to trust people that aren't in their group, because when you are interdependent, when you are in a collectivist situation, only the people around you are closer to the people around you than you are to anybody else. So you don't trust the people, the outside people, anybody in the out group. You are only trusting of the people in your in group. And of course, when I came to the Navajo Nation, it was difficult for me to make friends. Well, I make friends wherever I go, but it was a little bit more difficult for me to make friends because people were so close to each other, and they didn't really have room to include me, and so it was a bit different. Than moving to Oklahoma or moving to Nebraska, because there wasn't as much acceptance as there was in other places where I've lived. Bond and Smith in 1996 found that people with more interdependent views of self, are more likely to conform than those with more independent views. This may be because people with more interdependent selves view in-group members as an extension of themselves while maintaining distance from out-group members. Now, this is really kind of an interesting picture because this is a picture. The Japanese were an isolated society until the 1840s, when the ports in Japan were forced open by the American Navy. And this is a picture of an American that was drawn when they first forced open the ports. And as you can see, this individual looks almost animal-like. Certainly doesn't look Japanese. And of course, they're trying to make him look, well, anyway, this is how they saw Americans, as subhuman, as sub-Japanese, actually. In 1983, IBM tasked psychologist Gert Hofstede to assess their employees' opinions and interests. Hofstede administered questionnaires to 117,000 employees in 40 different countries. Hofstede was able to map the individualism of all the employees in each country. The country scores show a clear and striking pattern. And this is Hofstede, by the way. Hofstede discovered that the most individualistic country in the world is the United States, closely followed by other English-speaking countries and by Western European nations. Countries that scored high in collectivism were various nations in Latin America and Asia. Other research has found similar results. And of course, I have a picture of Kim Kardashian. What could be more individualistic than the Kardashians? Collectivism has been found to dominate in Asia, Africa, Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, and the South Pacific. Most people participate in collectivistic cultures where interdependent selves are more common. These countries encompass more than 80% of the world's population, and this is where they are. Everything in brown. Everything in yellow, those are in more individualistic countries. The state with the highest collectivism score by far was Hawaii, probably because of that state's large population of people with Asian ancestry. The next most collectivistic states were Utah and the states of the Confederate South. The least collectivistic states were in the Mountain West, the Great Plains, the Northeast, and the Midwest. And this is a picture of Diamond Head. This is Waikiki Beach. And that is the famous Pink Hotel that's been there since the 1920s. And this is Diamond Head. That's what it looks like. Individualism varies as a function of social class. Specifically, people from higher socioeconomic backgrounds tend to have more independent selves than those from poorer backgrounds within the same country. Wealthier Icelandic children tend to describe themselves more in terms of inner psychological traits than poorer Icelandic children do. Middle-class American parents emphasize the importance of self-direction to their children, whereas working-class American parents place greater value on conforming to authority figures. And this is according to Weininger and LaRue in 2009. Interdependent messages are a better fit with American students from a working class background. Some of the highest concentrations of universities in the United States are in the Northeast and the Midwest, where individualism is more pronounced. Psychological research within the United States has been largely conducted with participants who are even more individualistic than most other Americans, and that is a point of fact. So if you want to look where most of the research is coming out of in the United States, it's mostly coming out of the Midwest and the Northeast. In other words, Harvard, Yale, all the Ivy League schools, which are in the Northeast, Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Illinois, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. That is where most of the small colleges in the United States are in that part of the country, as weird as that may seem. I'm from Indiana. Indiana has, 23 small colleges and 5 major colleges in that relatively small state. If you look at Arizona, Arizona has no small colleges that I can think of. I can't think of any small colleges. New Mexico has one. I'm trying to think what it is. I've been there actually. I played a soccer tournament there. It's in Socorro, New Mexico, and it's the only small college in the state. The rest of them are state-run institutions. It's the same way in Arizona. Arizona doesn't have any small private colleges, but Indiana has 23. Ohio has like 35. Michigan has, any number. Wisconsin is the same way. Pennsylvania is the same way. Really weird that the educational structure is so much different in a place where people are more independent and more individualistic. Other cultural dimensions that researchers have investigated include societal tightness versus looseness. Societal tightness characterizes how strong cultural norms are and how tolerant cultures are of deviant behavior. This predicts level of prevention, focus, impulse control, and self-regulation. Another cultural dimension that has been investigated are cultural values. Values for universalism, benevolence, conformity, tradition, security, power, achievement, hedonism, stimulation, and self-direction. Other cultural dimensions that have been investigated: power distance, uncertainty avoidance, vertical horizontal social structure, relationship structure, context dependence, social cynicism, and complexity. One of the difficulties in studying cultural psychology is that individuals tend to be varied and complex. Cultures are highly variable and are resistant to categorization. All cultures are highly heterogeneous and contain a great variety of people. Cultural differences this book describes reflect general patterns of differences and not all or nothing statements. A number of researchers have identified women as more interdependent than men. The features of independent entities seem more characteristic of men than of women. There are issues of gender equality in most cultures. Women represent only about 3% of elected officials in Arab nations. Women represent 45% of the Swedish parliament. In Brazil, 50% of the men and women are literate. In Pakistan, twice as many men are literate as women. In the Netherlands, Germany, and Finland, on the average, people expressed views that men and women should be treated quite similarly. In India, Pakistan, and Nigeria, people tended to believe that roles, obligations, and the rights of men and women are clearly different, with men being perceived to have more rights than women. Within a culture, men and women tended to share fairly similar views about gender equality. In India, Pakistan, and Nigeria, women tended to embrace the gender attitudes of their respective countries. And these are Muslim women in Nigeria. In every case except two reversals in Malaysia and Pakistan, males have a significantly more traditional gender view than females, probably because traditional gender views benefit men far more than they benefit women. And this is an old Van Heusen tie advertisement. Show her it's a man's world. I'm not exactly sure why she has to be on her knees feeding him breakfast in bed. And I don't know why he's eating breakfast in bed with a shirt and tie on. But hey, that's an old commercial from the 1950s. Countries in which a large percentage of the population practiced Christianity, in particular Protestantism, were more likely to have egalitarian gender views, whereas countries with a large percentage of Muslims were associated with more traditional gender views. And this is, of course, a picture of Martin Luther nailing his declaration of the problems in the Catholic Church on the door of the basilica in Worms, Germany. Oddly, more northern countries express more egalitarian views, and more southern countries express more traditional gender views. The more urbanized the country, the more likely the country will have egalitarian views. A country's individualism score correlated positively with egalitarian views. One way to look at gender and culture is to determine which gender identity is viewed to be more essentialized, which gender is thought to reflect an underlying unchangeable essence, which gender has less flexible ways of being expressed in a socially approved way. Americans tend to view male gender identity to be more essentialized than female gender identity. Most Americans do not seem to find it disturbing or unusual for women to present themselves like men, wearing pants, having short hair, not wearing facial makeup, or participating in stereotypically male behaviors, girls playing with trucks or girls playing ice hockey. But how does this look to you? This guy in a dress. Does that look correct? Guy in a dress, girl playing ice hockey. Okay, this is a young lady. Does he? Oh, he doesn't have pearls on. Oh, it's just a necklace. I thought it was pearls. Anyways, so this looks okay, but does this look okay? Would you accept this before you accepted this? And if the answer is no, well, the answer is yes. I don't. Unless you see things differently than I do. I don't see men wearing dresses and high heels as correct. But I don't care if women play hockey. Many Americans do find it disturbing or unusual for men to present themselves as women, wearing dresses, high heels, or lipstick, or to participate in stereotypically female behaviors, playing with dolls or taking ballet lessons. Male identity is less changeable and thus more essentialized in the Western world. What's an example? What's going on right now? Something's going on right now. Oh, okay. The Republicans are complaining about um, women or men dressed up like women reading in libraries, reading to children in libraries. Drag queens is what they refer to them as. The big deal about George Santos dressing up like a woman when he lived in Brazil. As weird as this may sound, so they're all around the United States, wherever there are men who are dressed up like women with the makeup and with all the outfits, with female outfits, reading to children. They're afraid that it will show children that it's okay to think that way. They don't like it. And this is because it's so essentialized that males, of course, are stuck with the way that they are. They have to wear pants. They can't wear makeup. They have to wear running shoes or whatever, and not play with dolls and not take ballet lessons. In Hindu myths, many more male gods change into female goddesses than female goddesses change into gods. The Hindu religion involves goddess worship, and many of the most powerful gods are female: Kali, Parvati, Durga, and Maya. According to the Hindu religion, female identity is viewed as pure, strong, and powerful. In India, the male gender identity was more mutable and less essentialized than the female gender. And this is a picture of Kali with her many arms. She fights wars and she suckles babies. She cuts men's heads off. Always men's heads. She never cuts off women's heads. This is Kali again and her tiger. As you can see, this is kind of interesting. This trident. There's the trident right there. And here's her sword that she decapitates men with. This is Parvati. This is Durga. Kali's animal is a tiger, and Durga's is a lion, and Maya's is an elephant. Oh yeah, there's the elephant. Okay. Festinger in 1957 proposed that people have a powerful motivation to be consistent, and their cognitive dissonance is the distressing feeling that we have when we observe ourselves acting inconsistently. The belief that we can easily change and are expected to change is referred to as an incremental theory of self. Traits are malleable and can be improved. Aspects of the self are largely resistant to change, which is known as an entity theory of self. Individuals with this view see their attributes to be largely inborn. Entity and incremental self theories. There are two views children have of intelligence. This is the way my intelligence is, especially if it's large. No, intelligence will grow and develop. Research found that 60% of the Chinese high school students said the key to success in math is to study hard. In contrast, less than 25% of American high school students felt this way. Japanese believe more than Americans that intelligence is based on how hard you try rather than on what they are born with. Now, this is really important in my family because I have some relatives who have really astronomical IQs. The problem is they don't think they have to do anything with it. They can just sit there and people will come to them and ask them questions. So they don't have to be successful. They don't have to try to do anything. I have a cousin with an IQ that is higher than Einstein's. Einstein's IQ was in the 160 range. This guy's got an IQ in the 180 range. And as stupid as this sounds, He lives in a trailer. He's never done a lick of work in his entire life. Dropped out of middle school when he was in the eighth grade because his teachers were so stupid. And you know what he does all day? This is a second cousin. This guy, what he does all day is he watches television shows like Jeopardy, all the quiz shows, and he gets all the answers right. That's what he does all day. But he's never worked. His wife works and he doesn't. And he's got this astronomical IQ. Now, my idea, well, IQ just means that you have the possibility of being that successful. It means you probably will do well in school. That's all that IQ means. And according to him, I don't know what he thinks. Um, oh, I can't talk to him. My IQ is not anything close to his. So I'm not. And I've only spoken to him once, and he acted like I was the dumbest person in the world. But here I am. I have a PhD, and I'm teaching college classes. And what does he do? He lives on welfare, and he lives in a trailer behind his mother's house. That's all he does. Doesn't do anything with his intelligence. Sorry. This is a sore point with me. To get into a good American university, you typically need to get an acceptable score on the SAT. The SAT was originally designed to measure innate aptitudes and not efforts in one's classes. It turns out that studying hard can increase one's SAT score significantly. This has been a source of frustration for the test makers because the tests are no longer serving the function they were originally designed for, which has sparked much policy debate about their utility. And I was just reading an article about Harvard not requiring SAT scores anymore, or not using SAT scores to admit students. They are admitting students by their position in their classes. IQ tests are regularly given in public schools in the United States, and the results influence decisions on whether students should attend gifted or remedial classes. And this was going on when my kids were in school. In Japan, I actually taught what do we call it? The Talented and Gifted program. TAG program, talented and gifted. In Japan, and I taught those classes, the talented and gifted classes, when I was teaching high school. I only taught high school for a couple of years, but I was teaching the talented and gifted program. And I was thinking, why are we just why are we being so selective as to who we allow into these programs? This doesn't make any sense. Are we selecting people that we think should be in college? And the answer was, yeah, we're selecting the rich kids, we're selecting the kids with political power. That's what we were doing, and I didn't agree with that. When my kids were when I was in the military, this is kind of weird. Um, my wife at the time, and she's still my wife actually, she was an officer in the military, and I was enlisted. When she took my daughter into the school, they put my daughter into the talented and gifted program. When I took my son into the school, she couldn't do it. She was someplace else, and I needed to do it. So I took my son in. I was enlisted, and when I took him in, they didn't put him in the talented and gifted program. What's the difference? The difference was she was an officer and I was enlisted. Officers' kids get into the talented and gifted program. Enlisted kids don't get into the talented and gifted program. And that's exactly what happened, as weird as that is. Now, my kids have exactly the same IQ. Both of them do. My daughter seems to try harder, but the reality is both of them have exactly the same potential. And that's really all that IQ means. IQ just means potential. You have the potential to be successful. In Japan, and both of my kids have been successful. My daughter has a master's degree and a bachelor's degree. My son has two master's degrees and a bachelor's degree. And they're both relatively successful. In Japan, to get into a good university, you need to do well on university entrance exams that test your mastery of a large amount of material. The Japanese bar exam to become a lawyer is notoriously difficult. Only 2.5% of people pass it every year, and those that do, on average, have failed the exam 4 times before ultimately succeeding. Approximately two-thirds of those taking the American bar exam each year pass it, with about three-quarters of them passing it on the first attempt. So there's a difference, either there's a difference in the test or a difference in the attitude. The five-factor model of personality started as a personality profile test developed to test U.S. Air Force officers in the 1950s by Tupes and Crystal. They were the ones that came up with this whole thing in 1961. Tupes and Crystal used factor analysis to determine which of Cattell's 16 personality factors were significant. They came up with 5 that factored as most important over and over again. Now, when you read about the 5-factor model, you're not going to read about Tupes and Crystal, because Tupes and Crystal were doing this for the Air Force. And they didn't publish their results until much later. And then it was picked up in the 1980s by other researchers. And I don't have those other researchers. No, I don't. But when you hear about the 5-factor model, they will talk about the other researchers that in 1988 they published a paper saying these are the 5 factors. These are the 16 personality factors that Cattell came up with, that Tupes and Crystal were looking at. Warmth, reasoning, emotional stability, dominance, liveliness, rural consciousness, social boldness, sensitivity, vigilance, abstractedness, privateness, apprehension, openness to change, self-reliance, perfectionism, and tension. And they looked at all 16 of these and they chose 5 that fit the personality of the quintessential Air Force officer. Now you got to remember, Air Force officers are a little bit different than Army officers. They don't really boss people around nearly as much as in the Army and the Marines and in the Navy. In the Air Force, these are the individuals that become pilots. So that's what they were looking for. They were looking for people that could become pilots, that could, if necessary, they could lead. And those were the criteria that they were looking at. So these are the 5-factor model of personalities that they came up with. Openness to experience reflects a person's intelligence and curiosity about the world. So openness to experience is one. Conscientiousness indicates how responsible and dependable an individual is. Imagine this person flying an airplane or bossing people around. Openness to experience, being intelligent and curious. Conscientiousness, being responsible. Extroversion indicates how much an individual is active and dominant. And of course, if it's an officer, you want them to be dominant. Agreeableness is the extent to which a person tends to be warm and pleasant. So they not only need to be responsible and intelligent and curious and active and dominant, but they also need to be warm and pleasant. And the last is neuroticism. It's a degree to which an individual can be seen as emotionally stable and unpredictable. And the neuroticism is negative. They need to be not neurotic. In other words, they need to be predictable and stable. Emotionally predictable, emotionally stable, and predictable. The 5-factor model proposes that all personality traits largely reflect some combination of these 5 core traits. All personality traits should show significant correlations with at least one, if not more, of these core traits. The 5 factors can be seen to reflect the basic structure of personality. There is a question as to how well the 5-factor structure generalizes elsewhere. An analysis of indigenous Chinese personality trait terms found a set of factors that were not the same as the Big Five. So in China, in the United States, the Big Five fit. It especially fit military personnel, but it also fit people in the United States. But in China, it didn't fit as well. There were 4 factors emerged that were captured by the following labels. So in China, where it's collectivistic country. There were 4 additional factors. Dependability, reflecting responsibility, optimism, and trustworthiness. Interpersonal relatedness, reflecting harmony, thrift, relational orientation, and tradition. Social potency, reflecting leadership, adventurousness, and extroversion. Individualism, reflecting logical orientation, defensiveness, and self-orientation. Similar approaches have been taken in other cultures. Researchers looking at Filipino personality traits discovered 2 additional traits to the Big Five: temperamentalness and a negative valence dimension. In other words, temperamentalness means that you are temperamental to the extent that you want to control things. And that's what the negative valence dimension is. You won't let people influence you if you become a leader. So the temperamentalness had to do with you being a bully, as it were, as you being the person that could take charge, and you wouldn't let anybody do anything to change that. Hello? Hi. Okay. Okay, that's okay. Just buy stuff that if they just have plain stuff. Yeah, that'll work. Okay, yeah, okay, bye. Sorry, that was my wife. And in an investigation of 11 different language groups in South Africa revealed 9 underlying factors, some of which overlapped with the Big Five, but the other factors that did not: integrity and relationship harmony. And this is a picture of people in South Africa. Some studies in other languages reveal evidence for factors in addition to the Big Five. Other studies sometimes do not find evidence for all 5 of the Big Five factors, or 5 traits. In particular, openness to experience is the trait that emerges the least consistently in studies conducted in other languages. And this is a picture of Romania. That's a Romanian flag. And that was true in Romania. The north central Great Plains, especially around Minnesota and Wisconsin, is the epicenter for a friendly and conventional cluster, as residents are the highest in the country for the traits of extroversion, agreeableness, and conscientiousness. And this is where I live, and this is what they're talking about: Wisconsin and Minnesota. Wisconsin and Minnesota, eh? The western states, from Oregon down to Arizona, house the relaxed and creative cluster, where there is the lowest neuroticism and the highest openness to experience. The northeastern states, especially New York and Massachusetts, are home to the temperamental and uninhibited cluster, where people score the highest on neuroticism and the lowest on conscientiousness. And that is the end of the lecture. So my wife called just before the end of the lecture. Okay, I'll talk to you guys next week. That's chapter 5.